Could you please introduce us and let us know about what you're doing now in your career?
Okay. I'm Ward Cates. I'm the Associate Dean of the College of Education at Lehigh University. I'm a past president of AECT, and I'm currently the outgoing president of the EECT Foundation. So what was the second part of that one?
What are you doing in your career now, or heading toward retirement?
I'm headed towards retirement. You are correct. This is my 43rd year in higher education. I retire in June of next year and won't be an administrator anymore.
Excellent, excellent. What were the sorts of things that interested you in the field in the first place, and then how did your career progress from there?
Okay, well, I've been in it a long time. So I started in the audiovisual age. So I was intrigued initially with the sorts of things that we could do with film and videotape, which came along early in my career. And so I was in the position of sort of exploring what those technologies would do. I've always been a toy person. So I'm the guy who took his radio apart and discovered that electricity flows through the chassis. I discovered that after being thrown over the bed.
Yes.
But I think as a teacher I was interested. I was a high school English teacher and a special ed teacher before that. And I was interested in how to solve problems for students who didn't seem engaged. And the system had failed in one way or the other. And in some cases their parents had failed them. They had very low self-esteem, many of them, but they didn't seem to be able to learn. Dyslexia was a new idea at the time, and people weren't sure they even believed it was real. And there were students that I thought there was a way I could reach them. So I was trying out audio recordings, I was trying out slide presentations. As I said, it was a long time ago. And finding what we would now call modality approaches. And I wasn't looking for learning styles as such, but what I was really looking for was sort of an alternate pathway and redundant pathways to help students learn. That got me interested beyond the toys. I began to wonder if there were some pedagogical reasons that things worked or didn't work. Toy people like the devices. Instructional designers like the pedagogy, and the device is based on its affordances. All of these were terms I did not know. I didn't know what an instructional designer was. I didn't know what an affordance was. I knew pedagogy. They trained me in that. So I took a job after I left teaching in the public schools. I took a job at Duke University as their staff media specialist. And that was to train their new teachers in how to do the techniques that I was using with my students. And I thought, well, that's exciting, so I put in my resignation for my public school teaching position. I got down to Durham to start my job. I got down there and discovered I had half a salary. The provost had cut their budget on that, and I thought, well, I'm not sure exactly how we're going to eat. And he said, well, why don't you think about going back to grad school? So I said, all right, maybe, but that won't feed us. And he says, well, what does your wife do? And I said, well, she's a university librarian. He says, we can find her a job at the university library. So I went back to doctoral work unexpectedly. The world was not, Duke was not a tremendously powerful instructional design place. So I was learning instructional design mostly from my readings. My degree is going to say curriculum and instruction. But I was reading about things the wonderful thing about grad study is you get to read about things you've never seen before. I discovered there were people who taught this field, there were people who wrote about it, it was a research agenda, there was a long literature on it. At that time a lot of it was about programmed instruction. I was immediately engaged. It seemed wonderful to me, and I realized that there were things that could be done, that I was doing things without knowing why, that others knew why. So I went ahead and worked through that, and that got me into the field. And in effect, that's what hooked me. Instructional design is just wonderful. It's the music of the spheres. Everything comes together. You've got it all in one place, and you can, and it all makes sense. And it's promiscuous across fields. It doesn't care where the knowledge come from. And I'd loved psychology as an undergraduate, but it seemed very rarefied. It was mostly about neuroses, psychoses, and psychopathology, which is useful in understanding faculty meetings, but may not be as helpful in designing instruction. I was intrigued by the fact that there was educational psychology, that there was psychology of learning, that there were learning theories. So that's sort of how I got hooked on this. And then when the computer age came along, when I learned to program mainframes, which we all did, I guess, in those days, in my grad program. But then the micro came along later after I was out as a young professor. And because of that, I then had a device to play with that I could program. And that got me into thinking about interface, which is the other part of it. Instructional design is how everything's designed behind, but the interface is what the person interacts with, and there are psychological principles for that as well as perceptual principles. And I just loved that. So that was a lot of my later work. Now, I don't know if I answered your question.
Oh, you did.
Oh, okay.
Yes. Actually, then, where did you go from Duke then?
I went from Duke. There were 13 positions available that I could have gotten, and I submitted applications for all 13 of them. I knew some other people around the country who were like me, and I watched them get jobs one by one. And the 13th one, I got a call for the interview. So I went out to what was then Kansas State College of Pittsburgh in Kansas. It's in the southeast corner right across from Joplin, Missouri. And I think I knew my place in the pecking order at that point, having gotten to be the 13th. But the job sounded just like me. It was teaching teachers audiovisual. It was what I had done at Duke, only in a tenure track position. So I took the job at what was then Kansas State College of Pittsburgh. I moved to Kansas, to a little town of about 18,000 people, college town. College was about 4,000, so it was relatively small. It was a teaching institution. I taught there for, let me think about this, I taught there for 11 years and learned how to become a teacher. It was a place that you didn't have to publish very much, but I had been publishing, so I continued that, which enables you to go elsewhere at some point. And I was there when the micros came out, microcomputers came out, and then I was teaching microcomputer courses in education. So for me, it was a place to learn my profession. It was a wonderful little town. We didn't lock our doors for years. Nobody locked their car. There was no crime to speak of. We had our daughter there. It was nice. Then I from that point, I got very deeply involved in microcomputers. And actually, on the side, we opened an IBM dealership at a software development house. And another job offer came up, this time at George Mason University. And I tend to go to the job offer that sounds like me. When I'm less desperate for a job, because I had one. I looked at, they had a job that was about computer-based training. They needed someone who had a little bit more corporate knowledge, and they really were looking for an instructional design person. They didn't know the name either. But by now I knew the name, and I knew what they did, and I'd been reading for years. So I took the job at George Mason. At George Mason, I came in as an associate professor, and we were really close to DC. So it gave me a chance to work with the Smithsonian, gave me a chance to work with the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. It enabled me to talk a lot about instructional design with people who didn't know it. And my students took a programming course with me, but my programming course was basically instructional design, exemplified through writing something. So we'd solve an educational problem and figure out how to code it. Now that was in the early days, so we were writing in BASIC, which was, it was a language that allowed you to make many, many mistakes, but it did work in most cases. And The last 2 years or so working with the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, I was working on a project called the Civil War Interactive. And this was started when WETA said we have an educational, we have a series coming out shortly from an independent filmmaker that looks very interesting, and he wants to explore whether it be possible to create an educational product from what it is. Would you be willing to take a look at about 20 hours of uncut video and see what you thought of it? And I said, okay, yeah, I'd be interested in seeing it. And so they gave me 20 hours, I don't know how many videotapes, it was 10, 12, 13, something like that. And it was Ken Burns' Civil War, which was due to come out in about a month or two. So my wife and I went down and watched this in the basement of our house on the VCR unit and thought, wow, this is really good stuff. So we were part of a team that got a grant there to see if we could develop an educational product, the prescriptions for what an educational product would look like. So I was a senior instructional designer for it. We had content area experts, we had a video specialist, we had all the right players. So I then wrote up a design document on what it would look like for a new hypermedia product, and Apple was one of our partners. So we got HyperCard and a computer to work on. And so we designed that, we burned our laser disc, and we sort of created what we thought would be a product, but we hadn't coded anything. And what happened was that they were about to have hearings on the Capitol Hill on technology and education, and someone had seen the document somewhere and said, boy, it sure would be nice if we could show a demo of this. But of course it didn't exist, it was just paper. That's what instructional design documents are. So they said, well, if we could get you a course release, could you program this in 6 weeks? And I said, well, I have never worked on a Mac. I've been working in Windows, but Apple's our partner, so I'd have to have a Mac, and somebody'd have to burn the disk. And so we coded it up, and it ran. I fixed the last bug the morning of it, and it worked throughout the day. So that's not a sign of my talent, that's a sign that the gods were willing to forgive me for previous sins. So I was just thrilled that it worked. The result of that was that we became high profile. So now the project, we're invited to speak in Japan, we're going around to places, and someone nominated me for a position at Lehigh University, and I ended up going up to Lehigh, and they had more of the kind of work that I was doing in their educational technology program. Everybody was developing something. So it wasn't service courses mostly for teachers. It was mostly teaching instructional designers and software developers. And I was thrilled at that idea. So I went there, and that's now 25 years ago. And it's been a wonderful place to work.
That's excellent. Great. Okay, what were some of the major ideas or approaches and people that impacted your path, your career path?
Okay, there are so many. I was a blank slate, so it's pretty easy. I would think Robert Gagne's got to be pretty near the top. His Foundations of Educational Technology was a book that opened my eyes to things that I had not seen before. Dave Jonason's work collectively. Dave took us on a journey in which he was looking for things, and he looked everywhere. Because of his extraordinary talent, he could bring it all together. So he would raise questions in print before he had any clue what the idea was, and that meant all of us had to think about it, which I liked. He came out with a 3C model for constructivist design. That was really intriguing. Constructivism interested me, but my roots are in behaviorism because of my age and when I came along. So programmed instruction was all behaviorist. I don't think I believed behaviorism was the answer, but I do believe it's part of the answer. I don't think having opinions is enough. You have to actually have knowledge. So constructivism opened my eyes to a new idea for how it might be blended but I thought the two had to be blended. When I taught my students, I used to say, they're sides of a coin. The coin is not different simply because it has two sides. Its value comes from being able to spend both sides. If you sliced it in half, it's not really very valuable. I was really, Everett Rogers' work, Diffusion of Innovations, was just, I just loved it. I got it when I was doing my dissertation, and it changed my perception of the field. The change agentry idea, the idea of some of Ronald Havelock's work from Michigan on change agentry. And then a lot of my work's been on persuasion theory. I was really interested in cognitive dissonance, Leon Festinger, and the idea that we resolve things, that if one can induce a small, that in effect you can direct action in persuasion theory by helping by making the path easier, the path you want them to go into easier than the path than other paths available to them, and by helping induce in them some sense that they need to resolve their inner conflict, which is a big part of what we call curiosity in pedagogy, which is getting them to have an odd, to have something they didn't realize was a conundrum that they then could solve by learning something. Mm-hmm. And then I guess, I mean, as I said, there's so many of them. I know I'm leaving somebody valuable and important out, but they all sort of shaped my understanding. And I know, as I said, I'm leaving somebody out, but they're all there.
Excellent, that's great. Okay, then, how would you describe your research interests and aspirations, and the past, how it had progressed, and what your current ones are?
Okay. My current interest, what I'm working on right now, is how public history sites, those are sites for places like Colonial Williamsburg, Yankee Village, Essex, Connecticut, Mystic Seaport, and public science sites, which are usually related to museums, on the web. How do they use open educational resources to support teachers? And if they're using scaffolding, what sort of scaffolding are they using? And what are the best practices for making those open educational resources most valuable to teachers? So that's involved some taxonomies, some systems, and evaluations of them, identifying the places that have the most promising practices and the like. And a spin-off of that is how to help instructional design consultants work with those people. Since those people don't know about instructional design, in most cases their contracts are traditionally with software firms that set up their database, but they don't have an understanding necessarily of what the metadata might look like for those, nor what the interface might look like in order to help teachers. So that's an instructional design task. I would say in our field, your research agenda, any research agenda, maybe last 10 years. That's sort of the outside limit for most of it. If you're doing something new, if you're mining a particular vein, you're still going to have to, that vein's going to run out, and you'll have to find another vein beside it. Sometimes you can stay in the same mine, sometimes you change mines along the way. So I started out interested for practitioners in how various approaches could be used using technology to help teach subjects and solve common problems that you see. Mm-hmm. But I had a heavy focus on problems, learner problems and teacher problems, and that partially is out of my public school teaching, particularly the special ed experience. Mm-hmm. So I ended up focusing to some extent on motivational theory, management theory, how do you maintain interest and curiosity in learners who might be disengaged? So most of my early work was about that. Then I began to move that towards the higher ed side after I had been in higher ed for a few years. And I began to focus on, so how do you motivate college students How do you assess what they've learned? What are some approaches to assessment that might be different? That was pretty different from the technology part of it, but it was still problem-based. Then the microcomputers came out, and that meant suddenly I had a tool where we could program things. So I spent time talking initially about what design might look like for the microcomputer, and then I began talking about what the interface would look like. The move to interface was pretty dramatic, and that was where most of my work was for probably about 10 or more years. Things like immersive environments, how do they differ? What should help look like in such a system? Once again, we're back to identifying problems and helping learners, which is the theme that goes through everything I do. As open educational resources came along, that's probably 2001 maybe, somewhere in that range, then I became very interested in how might you share those objects. What sorts of things would you need to wrap around those? There was talk about learning objects and plugging them in and repurposing them, which sounded like a great idea, and my project had me going to the Defense Department and sitting in on the SCORM standards. So I was hearing all these conversations, but they all sounded like, they sounded affordance neutral. It sounded like all courses weren't made up of pedagogy, they were simply made up of blocks of content. And while that resonated with programmed instruction that I had learned, and most of the people in the room came out of the same, they were out of computer science, and they were aware of programmed instruction, it made sense to them, I'd already felt that was devalued, that programmed instruction was, it was a single path through a very dense forest, and that for some people they would never follow that path, it would not work for them. So I became more interested not in the objects, but in the glue that holds them together and the pedagogy that goes around them. So you can only use certain kinds of Lego blocks to build certain kinds of things. You can't build everything out of those blocks. And if you're going to repurpose, you need curriculum design. Because if you don't know across time where parts are likely to be used, then what will happen is one really good part will get used over and over and over again. And as any high school English teacher knows, if 2 years ago they taught the book you're supposed to teach this year, and these students have had it, they didn't get what they should have gotten when they were ready to get it, and that will be a lost opportunity. So a lot of my work is about sort of the scaffolding around it. I was a big champion of technology. As I said, I love toys. So I probably wrote some article like Basic for the Masses, everybody ought to do this, it's the best thing since sliced bread. I learned that that's not good scholarship, that you don't want to be a champion in your research agenda, you want to generate new knowledge. And that findings are not about data. Findings are about what the data might mean. So that in effect, when you give a finding, you are stating a fact, and you're basing it on your data, but you're not just going to say 58% of the people did X or said X. What you might say is, those who learn in this way appeared to find this more helpful. Then show your data that supports that. And that I've always told my students that good research, good scholarship is one in which there is a train of thought that is made up of all the people before you who've helped to pull along your research agenda, that your lit review is to show people that you don't just pick the people you like, you look at everybody, and that once they've read that and trust you and see that your data is well analyzed and see that you've thought about it, then you get to the discussion center, which I tell them is the caboose. And the caboose is all yours. And the caboose is the payoff. Because if a reader or a fellow researcher has gone through the rest of your article, they ought to feel like you gave them something worth knowing it for. I think when I was a young researcher, I didn't understand that. I think I was more content to stand on the shoulders of other people and tell people what I did, but not tell them what I thought it meant. I think I think that's part of the maturing of the research process, because we're all scared when we're young that we might not know enough to say what we should say. I was brasher than that, so I'll tell one story that shows how dumb I was. I was in an AECT, an AERA session, and and AERA sessions can be more aggressive in their own way in many cases. And I was sitting in the front row, and the person who made the presentation was talking about Robert Gagnet's work and was talking about what he thought it meant. And I really spent time reading his stuff, and I really cared about it because I thought, as I said, it was like brand news. It was gold. So when the time came for questions, I stuck my hand up and I said, I'm not sure I can agree with what you've said about Robert Gagnet's work. It doesn't seem to me it's so and so and so and so and so and so. It seems like it's more like this. But of course, I'm not Robert Gagnet, so I can't tell. And the room got completely quiet. And I thought, oh darn, I've done something wrong. I was about maybe 28 or 30, and I thought, uh-oh, my career just ended. And I couldn't figure out why everything was so quiet. And then a voice behind me said, well, I am Robert Gagnet, and he's right. And I thought, oh my God. And of course, I turned around, and I said, thank you. And I was bright red. And so I stopped after the presentation. I stopped and I said to him, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to speak for you. I didn't know you were in the room. And he said, it's okay. It's not a problem. And we had a conversation. It was very brief. And then he went to lunch, and I went to lunch. And it turns out we were across the street. I can't remember where we were. It might have been Michigan. We crossed the street, and we were both eating at the McDonald's. And it turned out to be a place where they play jazz, and we ended up talking about jazz. And he turns out to be wonderfully brilliant, turns out to be a really nice guy. I think that kind of courage that young researchers need to show and the story is not about me, the story is about my lucking into that occurrence. I think if you are willing to take a step in the last part of your research, if you're willing at the end of your article, at the end of your study, to try to take a risk and talk about something, you'll discover the people on whose shoulders you're standing will write you, they'll talk to you, they're interested in your work, and they see you as one of them, rather than you simply standing on their work and taking advantage of them. That, I think, is how my research agenda changed. I don't know that I generated anything comparable to anything that Bob Gagnet ever did, but it's still, yeah. The research agenda evolves as you get older and as you do things. And your students begin to guide you. They come to do your work, but they come to do it with their point of view. Does that help?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
And it also sounds like, would it be safe to say that you feel like AECT provides a forum for you to be able to have those interactions with the giants in the field? And
Oh yeah, there's no question. And I also think it affords me the opportunity to have the conversations with the evolving giants in the field. Mm-hmm. People you see who don't yet know that they're geniuses, who don't yet know that we're all going to be citing their theory in 3 years. Mm-hmm. And you also have a cohort of people, Dave Jonasson and I, and Peg Etmer. You get all of these people who are all about at same points in their career, who are rising and there are these active conversations. You can't get that. I've never been able to get that anywhere at any other organization. AERA, there are 15,000 people there, and the conversations don't get to be as small. I would say it's easier to buy an adult beverage at AECT and learn new knowledge. The other thing is that AECT is more about conversations. And it's intriguing to meet the star in the field and discover it's approachable. And That was very hard at AERA. There was, big names were there, people whose work I really cared about, but it was harder to get the conversation going, partially because there were too many people present. Particularly when you're a grad student. Grad students are more highly valued at AECT than they are at any of my other professional organizations. There seems to be more of a commitment to mentoring. There's more of a commitment to caring about what the graduate students are working on and what they care about than I see elsewhere. That's an error of selection. People come to AECT, find it here, and then stay, because it's a place where you have a sort of an intellectual family. So yeah, I love AECT.
How would you like to be remembered in the field?
It's an impossible question. I don't know whether it matters whether I'm remembered in the field. I come out of a tradition of service. Teachers come out of a service tradition. If I am remembered, if I would be remembered for anything, I would hope it would be for whatever I'd done in terms of mentoring people, in helping others. And to be honest, your name is only attached to that as long as the people you mentored are doing. But if they carry on the tradition, then you've succeeded. It only takes a trickle at the headwaters to make a river at the end. But you have to start somewhere. I don't think I'll be remembered as a famous scholar, because scholarship changes and technology evolves, and we're in a field in which the shelf life of a scholar is relatively short because the technology changes so quickly. Those who actually know my work, if they remembered me for helping them do better work, I'd be thrilled. That would be more than enough for me. I don't think I'm not much on recognition. Teachers generally don't even get thanked very often. But if you're in it for the thanks, that's a problem, because you won't be satisfied. I'd be happy if the people I had taught did well. I'd be happy if the field in any way benefited from any of my work, or the work of my students, which is more likely. Or if the people I mentored played a major role in the field in some way. So maybe that would be it.